This happened in the year of 2000, and that was, of course, prior to the era of iPhones. So, therefore, there is no good pictures and there's zero videos that have remained, and I had to make it all up from royalty free stock. I hope it's still enjoyable. When we still lived in Sayward, Kim had a friend who was a commercial fisherman. He used to fish for anything when that was still possible, like salmon, shrimp, prawns, or packing sea cucumbers, and even harvesting seaweed on contract for scientific purposes. That's how he had lost one of his boats. Just because there's still space to the top of the gunnel doesn't mean you should keep loading. Kim had been out with him the previous fall to pack sea cucumbers from Spider Anchorage to Port Hardy. When we were asked to join him and his wife for the next prawning season, I said yes right away. That was an adventure I would not forego, little that I knew. Kim was supposed to skipper the new edition of the fleet. Besides the liveaboard and the workboat, they added a smaller workboat that was still in use in Mexico, according to the previous owners. Kim's friend wired the money, and the new old boat was delivered a day before we had to depart for Port Hardy. That's how I learned that all the trees flower in Mexico just the same as here, because the deck of the Cricket was covered with alder tails. Sea trials were postponed, and the next morning saw everybody except me off to Kelsey Bay. The wake of the little flotilla was littered by empty cardboard boxes. "They'll decompose in the ocean in no time," as Kim's friend, the captain, liked to say. My part was to drive the old work truck up to Port Hardy, the mechanical soundness of which was highly suspicious, as I was told to gear down in order to shed speed and find a no-post or a hill to brake. After provisioning in Hardy, we set off for Sontula. At this point, I have to explain what had happened to the Cricket. One of the previous owners decided to extend the little vessel in order to have a walk around stern for better fishing. So here we have the cab plus fuel tank up front and an engine that's now midships with 4 foot of boat added behind. Kim found out the hard way that the Cricket would drive like a downhill bound dump truck. The little boat would push a giant bow wave of angry white water with only the radio antennas visible above that. We made it to Sontula and further on into the Broughtons and Echo Bay on the following day. We had an early start that morning because of the tides, which pushed and pulled the boats while crossing the mouth of Knight's Inlet. The visuals will be forever burned into my mind. The ensuing few days were spent with readying the prawn traps and filling the bait cups. Finally, opening day arrived. The workboat with Kim's friend, the captain, set off to secure the best spots. So did we with the Cricket. Our main task was to get the marker down at the vertical rock face that continued underwater and was, according to our friend, the best spot in the whole of the Broughton archipelago for prawn fishing. Sure enough, as soon as we reached the place, we saw several boats coming up the other channel. At first steering our way, then diverting after they watched us set the marker. This spot was a great prawning place for a reason. Strong currents washed along the wall, depositing nutrients along the way. The same currents moved our marker, and Kim had to set and reset it a couple of times without the benefit of a winch. 10 a.m., the official opening time, couldn't come fast enough. First, however, we had the DFO boat come for a visit. The officer pulled alongside our vessel, and although it had been renamed to fit the permit, the officer recognized her right away. "That's the Cricket, right?" he asked with an amused smile on his face. We confirmed, whereof the official wished us good luck and departed. Shortly after 10 a.m., Kim's friend joined us with the main workboat. Now the real work would start. The captain and his wife demonstrated the process of setting the traps. The drum had several lengths of line to which the brown traps had to be clipped on while the boat was moving and the line was unraveling, taking the traps to the bottom of the ocean. Now that was all nice and pretty if it hadn't been for the stray ends and loops from when the line had been adjusted and repaired. The line ends whipped past the line attendant in the process. Right then, our friend's wife was demonstrating, but this would be Kim's job for the majority of the trip. I had second thoughts at that moment. Sure enough, only a few days into the season, a line attendant was pulled into the water on another boat. Thankfully, it was okay. Something else had changed, and that was the attitude of Kim's friend, the captain. It felt like we had been thrown back a few centuries, and this was actually the bounty. The only thing missing was a nine-tailed cat. Despite all that yelling and driving, we managed to accumulate quite a booty. My job was sorting the prawns into the boxes for the onboard freezer. In order to run the freezer, the workboat was running 24/7, even at night when we were tied up in Echo Bay. One morning, however, we woke up to the melodic singing of the birds and the joyful splashing of the otters, and nothing else. I have never watched Kim jump out of bed that fast. In his underwear, he raced towards the workboat and had the engine hatch open before Captain Bligh was up. So here's the thing, when you hire a guy who is a heavy-duty mechanic to accompany you to go fishing, one would think that his qualified advice was something you would appreciate, if not hope for, in the first place. Back in Port Hardy, Kim had noticed that the old workboat was spewing quite some soot particles from the exhaust stack. He had diagnosed and mentioned to his friend that the injection pump was on its way out. The request to take a spare along, however, fell on deaf ears, which meant that at this point our prawning season needed to be suspended for a repair trip back to Port McNeill. I stayed behind to have an eye on the cricket and some of our equipment while helping out in the marina store with the guest cabins. Back then, Echo Bay was a rather sleepy marina that catered to the commercial fishermen just as much as to the tourists in summer. It was owned and run by an American couple in the summer that would spend their winters usually in Mexico to get the best bang for the buck. That same motivation caused the husband to have his dentures done down there as well. Unfortunately, it turned out that it didn't fit quite that well. So back in Echo Bay, the owner didn't wear them all that often, causing his wife to demand, "Put your teeth in, you look like a local," even when one of the locals might happen to be present. 4 days later, the fleet was back, and we continued our endeavor. Captain Bligh's mood had taken a turn for the worse, however, if that was even possible. We had to make up for lost time, and there could be no idle minute allowed anymore. Back out into the channel we went, pulling traps, sorting prawns as if our life depended on it, working to the rhythm of the diesel engine until, yes, you guessed it, silence. Quick flashback. When they were in Port McNeill and Kim had exchanged the pump, he noticed that the belts had worn out. So he wanted to change them right back then. Captain Bligh, however, didn't think he could spare that time. At least, however, he bought some spare belts. So there we were, drifting down the channel on a current too strong to set anchor. I suggested to radio one of the locals for a ride back to the marina to get the liveaboard boat and tow the workboat back. At first there was no response from Bligh until his wife elbowed the captain when she thought I didn't see it. The next morning we were ready to fly at it again, but at this point I had a weird feeling. Kim and I were the first on a workboat when my eye was caught by a DFO boat checking our gear out at the entrance of Echo Bay. Now here's the thing. We had an extended license because of the added boat, the Cricket, but that meant the trap line in her name could only be pulled by that boat, which was technically not very feasible. So I had enough at this point, 3 strikes in a row. Fate was telling me something. I announced that I would be leaving. Captain Bligh had observed the DFO boat from the bridge of the liveaboat and came out to join us. Actually, Captain Bligh fell into the chuck. It was Kim's friend who came over and announced that we would go back to Port McNeill. The crew left with the tide, and I decided to take the water taxi in the afternoon. I was looking forward to an uneventful ride on a sturdy crew boat with twin Volvos. I was the only passenger besides the skipper and his wiener dog. Happy and relaxed that I had this adventure behind me, I enjoyed the journey down Canoe Passage. Then I noticed the skipper skipping in and out of passages looking for a way to cross over to Port McNeil. Eventually, he had stopped the boat in the shelter of an island and tightened down the hatches, quite literally. Then he asked if I could hold his little dog, as this was his first rough ride. You've got to be kidding, I thought. The tide was wrong, the current pushing against it, and we had a little gale. I don't know which heart beat faster back then, the little wiener dog's or mine. For a couple times, the crew boat became a submarine, with green water washing all the windows as we dove through the gigantic breakers. We eventually made it to Port McNeil, but I had learned that twin walrus don't help you much when you have to climb over and through nasty breakers and feet-high chop. On arrival, my skipper noticed that his ride had come at a cost. One of the fasteners that held down the drive legs had broken. I was simply happy to be alive. Kim and the rest of the crew had left earlier that day. When the gale started, they had ducked into Port McNeil Harbor, where I joined them for a glass of wine. The end. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.